sister of the Pleiades, walks in beauty like the night, oh, that is best, dark and now lost to me.
You can advertise your business on Night Dreams Talk Radio, and you will be heard worldwide. Why not contact us at nightdreamstalkradio@gmail.com.
Do you have a paranormal story you want to share on Night Dreams Talk Radio? You could be a guest. Email us at nightdreamstalkradio@gmail.com. If you would like to hear Night Dreams Talk Radio on your local radio station, let them know. Tell them to check out www.nightdreamstalkradio.com, and thank you.
You're listening to my friend Gary Anderson on Night Dreams Talk Radio, the best in paranormal radio.
Now, John, I told you, we're not the best on the radio. We're not the worst, but we are on the radio. So that's saying something. We got Marc Cushman. We're talking about Star Trek. We're talking about William Shatner. And somebody I got to know before they passed on, Robert Culp, I Spy. That, to me, was one of the most, eye-opening shows when I was a younger person. Yeah. I tell you, I dreamed of being a spy and traveling, to Italy, to France, to Tokyo, and, having all these beautiful women chase after me and fighting spies and all that stuff with a little bit of twist of comedy.
It was a really unique show, and it really invented the buddy genre. And Bob told me this. He said, "Look, people think Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and all that, is buddy genre. No, it wasn't. One would be the foil of the other. I Spy started the buddy genre, where it's two guys who have each other's back, who are out in a dangerous situation, but have a sense of humor and can lighten the tension with their humor. And we've seen that scenario play out in Starsky and Hutch and Miami Vice and Lethal Weapon and so many others. But it started with Spy. And Bob Culp and Bill Cosby and Sheldon Leonard is the executive producer, and came on in 1965 and ran through the end of the 60s. And it was a top-rated show when it went off. But they were all exhausted because they filmed that show around the world. And they invented the technology to do that, which really has changed the whole production way that we do things. So it was not only inventive in a creative level and on a character level, but also on a production level, and it opened the door for interracial casting.
Oh, it did, but I just remember some of the beautiful scenes, like, in Tokyo or on a Greek islands, it made you you wanted to watch it because of the locations, too. Come on. Yeah, some of it was done in Desilu, in the studio, but I mean, the bulk of it was actually done on the streets and buildings and stuff like that. I mean, I just think of how hard it was at that time with the technology to be able to do it, and they pulled it off beautiful.
Well, that's why I did a book, is because I was watching that show. It was being repeated on some channel, I think A&E or TV Land, I don't know where. And I was watching it. I'd watched it when I was younger. I was actually too young to watch it when it was on the network because it was a 10 o'clock show, and that was past my bedtime, but I was watching it in reruns in the 70s. And so I'm watching it about 15 years ago, and I'm thinking, how did they do this? Because you see them out, Cosby and Culp out in Hong Kong on the streets, and hundreds and hundreds of people surrounding them, milling around on the streets and so forth, and nobody's looking at them, and they're having their conversation, and they're doing their business and so forth. And I thought, how did they do this on a TV budget? And I ran into Bob Culp, and I said, look, I tried to buy a book. I wanted to buy a book that told me how you guys did it, and there isn't one. And he said, yeah, me and Bill talk about that all the time. We don't understand why nobody's written a book about this show. And I said, I will, if you'll let me interview you, and so forth. So I interviewed him. I went out to his house 7-8 times and talked to him on the phone another couple dozen times, and talked to Bill Cosby and talked to everybody who was involved in the show who was still around, and did this book. And it's fascinating. Like in Hong Kong, they built a thing called the sweat box. They didn't call it a sweat box when they built it, but they called it that after they built it, because the cameraman would have to be inside of this box with a hole cut in it for the camera lens. And they would put that on a street corner so that none of the people would look at it. They wouldn't think, oh, they're shooting something. And they put wireless microphones on Cope and Cosby and have them standing over on the corner doing their dialogue. So you didn't see any microphones, you didn't see any cameras, and they're shooting this thing. Well, the reason they called it the sweat box is because after they did a couple takes, they would call to the cameraman, okay, that's good, and there'd be no reply. They'd find out that he had passed out in there because the humidity was so high and the heat and everything of being in there would just knock him out. So they had to really be very inventive about how they were going to shoot that show in order to go to all the locations they were doing it on without bringing an entire studio with them. And they built a thing called the Cinemobile, which they would put onto a flying tiger, and they would fly it to Greece and fly it to Italy and fly it to these places. And it was basically like a van with everything you needed in it to shoot a movie, and on the top was a platform that could rise up to get higher shots and things of that nature. They brought in the Airflex cameras, wireless microphones, quartz lights, all these things that Hollywood wasn't using at that time that were compact, and they could do it. And Steve McQueen even hired the I Spy production unit to shoot the car chase scenes in Bullitt, because only they had the type of equipment where they could get inside the car with him and actually shoot it going up and down these streets in San Francisco without an entire studio behind him.
That is so interesting. And back then, the cost factor, that Shelton had to put out, it had to have been enormous.
Well, that's one of the reasons the show went off. The main reason is he had put out so much money. He was anxious to get the show into reruns so he could start recouping his money. The other reason is they were all just very tired. I mean, they had been picked up for another year. They had already, Cosby and Cope had gotten all their shots. They were going to be going to Bangkok to shoot some episodes, and then going to Sweden, and then England, and so forth. And it got pulled at the last moment. And Cope thought the show had been canceled. So did Bill. And it wasn't until I did the book 40 years later that I brought them the documents that showed them that no, Sheldon had pulled the plug on the show. They never knew that. Even find out 40 years later, it must have really hurt. It must have. I think we talked about this, Gary, but for a lot of your listeners, it's probably the first time they may hear this, is that when I told this to Bob Cope, he was shocked, and he got depressed for about a week. I mean, it really worried me. I thought, geez, I thought he'd be happy to hear that the show was still doing great in the ratings, and he had kind of a opposite reaction. And because he realized that Sheldon had betrayed him, he hadn't told him the truth. Sheldon told him that NBC had canceled the show. NBC actually wanted to do a 2-year pickup. They wanted to pick up 2 more seasons, and nobody ever picks up 2 seasons at once. So he didn't tell the truth to Bill and Bob. He wanted to take the show off and get into reruns and get his money back. And so Bob was depressed for about a week, and then he calls me, and he sounded like Kelly Robinson. He went from sounding like the method actor to Kelly Robinson, the big toothy grin and talk and jive and everything. And he was in a great mood. And I said, "You sound so much better." And he said, "Yeah, it really kind of threw me for a loop. But I realized we went out on top." And Bill feels the same way now. They both had kind of knocked them down a little bit at first because, you can understand this, that somebody that you worked with and you trusted, who was almost like a father figure, didn't tell you the true reason the show was coming off the air, and you believed this for 40 years. And then when you find out the truth, instead of feeling good, you feel bad, but that only lasted about a week, and then they both felt great.
Yeah. Sheldon, for a lot of people don't know, he was a famous, gangster in the what, in the 40s and 50s, or at least I know in the 50s, that playing against...
1940s, yeah, he always played a mobster. And in the 50s, he started getting into production and writing, directing, producing, and when he did I Spy in the mid-60s, it was Sheldon Leonard Presents. And a lot of people don't know Bob Cope co-created the show. That's why there's no created by credit on I Spy. The only show I've ever seen on TV that doesn't say who created it. All it says at the beginning, during the title sequence, is the first thing that comes on the screen is Sheldon Leonard Presents. Because Sheldon didn't want to share the created credit with Robert Culp, who was a Emmy-nominated writer, terrific writer, and he brought the property to Sheldon.
Yeah, I don't know. I really lost a lot of respect when I found out that Sheldon did what he did. I mean, I guess, he wanted to get his money back. I guess that was more important. And he gambled. As I remember you being on the last time, he was trying to push a show that the network thought was going to tank. And it did tank. My Friend Tony. Yeah. And NBC came to him. They didn't want My Friend Tony. And they were offering him a 2-year pickup on I Spy or 13 episodes of My Friend Tony. And they had promised him both shows could be on the air. And Mort Werner called him and said, we can't give you the second hour this season, so you got to pick. And Sheldon picked My Friend Tony as kind of the hell with you to Mort Werner, knowing that NBC so much wanted 2 more years of I Spy. But again, Sheldon wanted to get his money back off of it. He wanted to get into reruns, and he was tired of traveling the world at that point. So he thought My Friend Tony was the way to go. It got canceled after 13 weeks. Yeah, I bet he regretted that, because from what I remembered what you said and doing research, that was pretty much the end of his career.
He was the most successful producer in TV at that time. I mean, he was the executive producer of Dick Van Dyke, Andy Griffith Show, Gomer Pyle, the Bill Dana Show, the Danny Thomas Show, on and on. The Mothers-in-Law, I believe, a couple others, and then I Spy. But after he pulled I Spy away from the networks all kind of got together on this, and they kind of blacklisted him. So he had a few more shows, but none of them lasted more than 13 weeks. A couple of them only lasted 6 weeks. So he went from being the top producer in television to pretty much his career was over. That's what happens when you fight the networks.
One thing about Robert Culp, the greatest American hero, you could see Robert Culp, Kelly Robinson in that. Yeah. The big toothy grin. There was 2 Robert Culps. I learned that very quickly as I got to know him. There was Robert and there was Bob. And Robert was a very serious method actor. He'd come out of New York, and he was a stage actor, and he was like James Dean. He was very serious and could brood, and everything. And then there was Bob, who was Kelly, basically, the big grin and the jive talking and the jokes and everything else. And he kind of went back and forth between these 2 characters, these 2 moods. And he would call me, and I always knew whether it was. Sometimes he'd call and he'd say, "Hi, Mark, it's Robert." The 2 days later, he'd call me up and say, "Hey, Mark, it's Bob." It was like 2 different guys. But I really respected him. He had great integrity. He had amazing talent. And, but he shifted back between these two moods. But Kelly was a character of his creation. And if you remember I Spy, and you do, certainly, Gary, but for your audience, Kelly Robinson could be moody, too. There were some very dark episodes of I Spy. Well, that was him. I remember, because, I got to know him, before he passed on. And it was a fluke, he I don't know. But I can honestly tell you this, that Kelly was actually part of Robert Culp. That was his deep personality. It came out with his flaws. That's what he used to say. Kelly Robinson is me with my flaws.
Yeah. And absolutely, because Kelly